Good evening to you all, and welcome to the all-new Seaden presents Spookinory. This new tale is in honour of the brave people of the Royal Air Force Bomber Command, who sacrificed so much in treacherous conditions and who have only just recently been recognised for. This tale is titled The Journey Home. Bastian and his wife Charlotte sat down at the dinner table to eat their meagre meal that she had cooked. It had been a dreary day in Martin-Église in northern France. The rain had fallen hard all day, which had drowned out the sound of gunfire and artillery rounds. The German stronghold of Dieppe had been battered all throughout the week and was showing the scars of the Allied bombardment. "This is a fine meal, dear," Bastian told his wife. "Thank you, my love," she replied. By now, which was early evening, the rain had stopped and was slowly drying away into the ground. "I wonder how long it will be till this war is at end," Bastian cried as he placed his head into his hands. "I have heard rumours that it shan't be much longer. I was talking to Marguerite yesterday, and she'd heard on the radio that something was going to happen." "Please be the case. We are running low on food, and I don't think we can last much longer with what we have here. Please, my love, have faith." Charlotte placed the dishes into the sink and retrieved 2 scarred mugs from the cupboard and placed them on the table. "We still have some wine. Let's toast to those who are going to save us," and she poured 2 small portions of wine into the mugs. "Vive la France et la victoire aux Alliés." A slow whining noise of the air raid siren started in the distance, the tone getting louder and higher into the night. "They're coming again," said Charlotte. "Probably come to finish off the stronghold." The German stronghold in Dieppe stood strong since the Blitzkrieg. It held 1,500 men armed to the teeth and led by Gerd von Rundstedt. The Royal Air Force had committed 74 squadrons to the bombardment of Dieppe, including the Royal Navy with 6 divisions of commandos and 1 infantry division. No one would realise that this operation was doomed to fail. A handful of bombers were sent to soften the defences before the land forces were to arrive. And this is what Bastian and Charlotte could hear arriving now. The air raid siren wailing at full blast heralded the bombers' arrival. After a few minutes, the low drone of the bombers could be heard alongside the sirens. The sound of anti-aircraft fire began ringing out into the night. Bastian stood up from behind the table. "We must get to the back room, dear," he said. Charlotte stood up and walked with Bastian to the back room where they would be safe. Most of the bombardment from the Allied forces had not penetrated that far south of the Dieppe, but they had to be safe, so to the back room it would be for the next couple of hours. They hurried in and huddled in the corner and held on to each other and prayed for their safety. After a while, the sound of guns ceased and the air raid sirens stopped, but instead there was a low droning sound coming from the distance. Bastian picked himself up from the corner of the room and walked over to the window to look and see what was outside. In the distance, he could see an aeroplane heading towards their home. "We must go outside," Bastian called to Charlotte. She came out of the corner and walked towards the door with Bastian. Everything was still in the same place as it was before they entered the room. They approached the front door of the cottage and turned the handle, opened the door and stepped outside. The droning of the plane got louder. Bastian could hear one of the engines coughing and spluttering, and as they turned the corner of the cottage they could see the plane from which the sound was heard. Fire had engulfed the plane. A DB-7 flown by the Royal Air Force was hurtling towards them. Pieces of wings and tail were missing. Both Pratt and Whitney engines had stopped. The remaining parts were nothing but balls of fire. "Run!" called Bastian to his wife. They both turned and ran and hid in a grouping of trees that would keep them in safety. They stood still, idle, watching the plane plummet to the ground. Within seconds, the terrible event that was unfolding in front of them was over. The DB-7 smashed into the ground with such force that pieces of aircraft were thrown in all directions. Flame erupted and spread across the surrounding area. Fortunately for Bastian, it missed their home and they were safe. They stood in silence and silently prayed for the souls of the men inside. After a few moments, Bastian and Charlotte slowly walked over to the remnants of the plane. Please don't, Bastian. You might get hurt, Charlotte called out. There won't be any survivors. Please come away. She hurried over to Bastian and pulled him away from the burning wreckage. They hurried back into their home and closed the door. The emotions of seeing the tragic loss of life had gotten too much for Charlotte. She collapsed on the floor in tears. Bastian came over and crouched beside her and held her in his arms until she fell asleep. Morning came, and as always, the rain was falling. The fires from the DB7 had extinguished, leaving the charred remains in a large crater the size of Bastian's cottage. And it wouldn't be long before the Gestapo would arrive to examine the area, so Bastian had to work quickly. He rushed outside to the remains to examine if there was anything that would be worth hiding from the Germans. Any information would be value to the Germans at this time, so he had to act quick and dispose of anything that could give away any information. Upon looking on the wreckage, he knew there would be nothing that anybody would find. There was hardly anything left. What was left was hidden under the ground from the force of the impact. Bastian slowly walked back into the cottage and placed the kettle onto the burner to make some tea. That day would consist of waiting for the Germans to arrive. And sure enough, they came, and then they left as soon as they realised there was nothing to see. Of course, they questioned both Bastian and Charlotte. They obviously knew nothing. All they could tell them was the plane hit the ground so hard the plane disintegrated on impact. The Germans were satisfied and left without any other questions. The 6th of June 1944 would see the end of the Germans' reign over Europe, and by the 8th of May 1945, the war in Europe was over. With the war at an end, the people of Europe joined together to rebuild the tatters of their lives. Churches, hospitals, schools and homes reappeared. Nations working hard to repair what was lost, and life returned to normal, but the memories would live forever. Mark and Maria sat down at the table silently, tears in their eyes. It had been a very hard day. Mark had worked very hard on the farm his family had owned for over 100 years. Generation after generation worked the fields endlessly. Now another generation had departed. Mark's father, Bastian, had passed away the week before, almost exactly a year after Charlotte had died. 2 generations remained on the farm. Mark's son René was already a great asset to his father. He worked hard, but could be a bit of a dreamer. René had already gone to bed, leaving his mother and father in the kitchen. I miss him so much, Maria sobbed. We'll be fine, Mark replied. We have to continue where father left off. And the pair started reminiscing of the fun times and stories Mark's father would tell him. Mark had a particular favourite of his father's tales, the day the Germans arrived to question them about a crashed bomber during the war. Bastian had a way of telling the tale seriously one minute and putting a joke in the next. Mark knew when he was being serious, so could tell what was real and what was made up. He would tell Mark that he told the Germans to sit on a grenade and dance for the information. He'd have a grin on his face when he said it. Mark knew that that was the joke and didn't take it seriously, but was also proud that his father didn't like the Gestapo or the Germans. Bastian would show him the very spot the DB7 had crashed and would always say a prayer before they walked away. He had great respect for the site and wouldn't allow anything to be put over there apart from a single flower off a rose bush that started to flower the very day after the crash. The rose bush would bloom beautiful white flowers. When in bloom, Bastian would pick one rose and place it on the crater. Mark would continue what had now become a family tradition and did this with honour. Bastian would tell him also of the sounds that he would hear every year on the anniversary of the raid. Mark was always baffled by this part. His father never grinned or joked about this when he retold that story. Every year on that fateful night, you would hear the sound of the bombers flying over, then the sound of a single bomber, a crashing, crunching, exploding sound would be heard. Then all would be still and quiet again, Bastian would recall. They even stood outside to see if they could see where the sound was coming from, expecting a bomber to crash, but never saw a thing. Mark couldn't even hear it. He trusted his father and would believe him. Even Renee sat outside before to hear it, but to no avail. It was getting close to that time again, and so that particular tale was retold by Mark during the wake. People listened with pride. After such a sad day, Mark and Maria retired to bed. The following day was back to normal. Rennie had left early to plough one of the fields ready for planting. Mark had gone to the cow field to collect the cows in for milking, and Marie was collecting her ingredients together to do some baking. First, she had to go and place a rose on the crash site. Today was the anniversary and it was her turn. She walked outside and over to the rose garden. She gently picked the biggest, brightest and open rose she could find and made her way to the site. She approached the chestnut gate and pushed it open. Bastian had placed a fence around the area and would dutifully tend the site, regularly checking every part of the fence and replacing anything that was damaged or rotten. Marie knelt down in the centre and slowly placed the rose down. She stood and bowed her head, said a small prayer, then left and made her way back to the kitchen. The day went by. Mark and Renee returned from their work, cleaned themselves up and sat down at the table for dinner. Marie had decided that, as it was the anniversary of the crash, that in honour she would cook an English meal. She had cooked a beef stew. Renee joked that it wasn't quite English, as Marie put herbs in, and that it wouldn't have been put in normally. They all found this rather amusing, but enjoyed the meal regardless. Afterwards, Renee went outside and sat facing the crash site and smoked a cigarette. Marie was very anti-smoking, but allowed Renee to anyway, but only outside, which he respected and never smoked indoors. An hour had gone by when suddenly Renee came bursting in through the door. "I can hear it! I can hear it!" he shouted. Mark rose from his chair, startled by Renee's entrance. "You hear what?" he shouted. "The plane! I can hear it! It's here!" And Renee ran back outside. Marie and Mark ran outside to see Renee standing at the fence. They too could hear the low humming of a plane. Mark looked at Maria. "It can't be," he said, in awe of the situation. The three scanned the skies, but could not pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It became louder and laboured, as if the engines were coughing and spluttering out of existence. Suddenly there was a loud bang, and all went quiet. Mark, Maria, and Renee stood motionless, taken back by what they had experienced. The truth was revealed. Bastian was right. He hadn't made it up. But why had they not heard it before? Why only now did they hear it? Why? These questions would go through Mark's mind for days, put him off his work. He was constantly pondering all the possibilities. There were no lights, there was no plane, so what was it? Renee also struggled to understand it. He stood to struggle constantly to get his head around the experience, but he managed to shrug it off and move on with his work, pushing the ifs, buts and maybes to the back of his mind till he had finished his duties. That evening they sat silently until they heard it again. They would rush outside. 5 minutes later they would walk back in again, still asking the same questions to themselves. No one wanted to discuss what they had heard. If thoughts about the happenings could be heard, the room would be filled with questions and not one of them had any answers. The following morning, Mark was awoke by Maria running into the room. "Mark, get up quickly. You're wanted on the phone." Stunned by this sudden awakening, he staggered out of bed, grabbed his trousers and, half running and half stumbling, due to him trying to put his trousers on in mid-stride, arrived at the telephone table by the front door. "Hello, bonjour." Mark spoke down the phone and waited for a reply. Good morning, Mr. Timon. My name is Dr. Francis Perlman. I am a military archaeologist. Myself and my team have been studying crash sites from the last World War, and we would very much like to hear about the crash bomber that came down at your farm. Your father had called us a few months ago and sent us a few photos of the site. Mark was stunned. The man spoke so fast. The information was hard to catch and take in. "Please, sir, slow down," Mark replied. I'm so sorry. May I call you Mark? Of course you can. Proceed slowly, Doctor. Slowly the doctor continued. I have a team of specialists that look into and study crash sites from the war. Mark sighed. Let me guess, Doctor. You want to come here and look through the site? That's correct, Mark. Would this be possible? When I spoke to your father about this back in March, he was happy for us to visit. Our aim is to see if we can find closure for some of the families that lost loved ones, the doctor replied. You may come, but you need to leave it as best as you found it. Mark was quick at making sure that the site would be respected. The doctor was about to continue when someone behind him distracted him, and he paused. Sorry, Mark, the doctor finally said. We have the best equipment at our disposal, and we will do our best not to disturb the site too much. After 10 minutes or so, Maria could hear the phone go back onto the receiver, and Mark walked into the kitchen and sat at the table. He picked up his mug and lifted it to his mouth. There is a team coming in the next couple of days to see the site. Maria was shocked to hear this. But they will disturb the site, she cried. Maria was passionate about it also, and wanted it left as it was. Mark reassured her that nothing would be disturbed unless they find something. Then they will decide what the next step would be with them. On hearing this, Renee agreed that it was for the best. Over the next few nights, they all heard the sounds of engines, followed by the large explosion. And still no signs of any plane were seen, just the sounds. During the coming days before the doctor's arrivals, they would sit at the table and discuss what would be the best, if they had found anything. They agreed if anything was found, they would allow the team to take any remnants back to England. The day of the team's arrival swiftly arrived. Mark had received the call. The team had arrived in Dieppe and were about to start their drive to the farm. Mark put down the phone and called Maria and Renee into the kitchen. He announced that the team were on their way, and they set about finishing their preparations for their arrival. They're here, Mark shouted suddenly. He turned the coffee pot on and took a handful of mugs out of the cupboard and set them on the table amongst the other tea and coffee utensils. Maria would normally have this already by now, but today Mark beat her to it. He reached for the milk out of the fridge and placed it on the table, put his feet in his slippers and headed towards the kitchen door. Maria by now had heard the commotion and had risen from her slumber, put on her dressing gown. Yawning and stretching, she made her way down to the kitchen and set about making breakfast. Renee had already left. It was his turn to move the cows. They practiced good grazing rotation, moving the herd from one field to another every month to allow more succulent grass to grow in the field already churned up by them. Mark turned to Maria as he reached for the doorknob. They've arrived. I will go and keep them a little occupied until you're ready to give them in. He gave her a half-hearted smile and he opened the door. He was still a bit dubious about what was happening. He had some reservations about disturbing what lay there. However, the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. It was for closure and for the relatives. The sun was strong and beamed down onto the porch of the cottage. The heat was warming as he stepped into the sunlight and out across the yard to the front gate. He could see the jeep making its way up the driveway, with 6 passengers on board and towing a small trailer, most likely holding the equipment that they needed. Mark held up his hand and gave a gentle wave, as if to signal them over. The jeep slowly pulled up to him and the engine died. The door opened and out hopped a thin, smallish man, his hand already outstretched to greet Mark. You must be Mark, and grabbed Mark's hand. Yes, he replied. Mark was taken aback by the doctor's friendliness. This time in the morning, Mark was never this chirpy. Sorry, I'm Dr. Perlman. We spoke on the phone? Still shaking Mark's hand. I gather, Mark replied, and the pair burst into fits of laughter. The other occupants opened their doors and got out to greet Mark also. The laughter then died off. We have been after this one for a long time. It is believed to be the last of the squadron, and it's taken us a number of years to locate her. And Dr. Perlman grabbed Mark by the shoulder and walked with him to the house, partly explaining their reasons for being there. Once all the people had gathered and sat in the kitchen, Dr. Perlman introduced his 5-man team. Carlos was his tech guy, always cleaning and checking the equipment. Sherry was in control of the archives and controlled every piece of paperwork that left the site. Mike, Dave and Barry were the hands-on guys that hired the heavy equipment and would be the instruments needed to find what remained of the aircraft. Within an hour, they were all chatting about what will happen over the next few days. The area was already secure after Bastian had erected the fence shortly after the war. Using ground sonar, they would scan the area, and once the charts were complete, they would start handling the hotspots, digging carefully at the places where the highest concentration of signal was coming from. They would then clean all the items, take photos, then log and pack everything ready for transportation. The squadron that this particular aircraft came from was based at RAF Hunsdon, a few miles north of Harlow in Essex, and was used as a satellite unit of RAF North Weald. All but this aircraft had been found. Once uncovered, the squadron would be once again complete. The team set up their tents and equipment ready for the following morning, and by the time they finished it was sunset. They were ready. They cozied themselves into their tents for the night. The last thing Maria heard was the team joking and giggling about the Waltons' TV show before it all went quiet. Sunrise came quick. The 6 team members woke lazily, gathered themselves, and proceeded to walk towards the farmhouse. Maria was waiting at the kitchen door with coffee in hand. "Come on in and sit down. I have breakfast ready for you," she greeted them, ushering them inside. They sat around the table, and the smell of egg and bacon had filled the room, tickling their noses and making their mouths water. Dr. Perlman lifted his mug to his mouth. "Now I could get used to this," he chortled as he gulped a mouthful of coffee. Mark then entered the room, walked over to his wife, gave her a peck on the cheek, grabbed his usual mug and sat at the table. "Would you mind if I joined you?" he asked politely. "Of course," replied Carlos. "We welcome any help." Dr. Perlman then turned to Mark. "We will show you the ropes once we have devoured this beautiful meal." It didn't take long before that meal was finished. The archaeological team picked up what things they had with them and walked outside. Mark joined them. "I will show you everything we need you to do. You and your family are very valuable to us," Dr. Perlman exclaimed. "This is the last of the squadron, so hopefully what we are looking for will be here." Dr. Perlman then picked up a tray of tools. Inside were various trowels, brushes and utensils, all the things they needed to clean up anything they should find in the soil. Dr. Perlman then turned and passed a tray of utensils to Mark. "Your job will be to help me clean any of the objects that come out of the ground. These are very important as they're the last remnants of the aircraft, so we must take extreme care not to damage what we find." Mark gladly nodded and walked with the doctor to the edge of the cordoned-off area. They stood there for a while, and then turned and walked into the side of the tent. Inside was a long trough with about 3 inches of water inside. "Once we bring the objects into you, we would like you to wash everything and place on the table on the opposite side of the tent." Mark agreed and placed the tray down on the table and began to withdraw the utensils and take them over to the trough. The doctor left the tent and joined the rest of the team inside the crater, and it wasn't long before he could hear excited cries, and the doctor ran back into the tent with the first items to be cleaned. When he came into the tent, he was holding a myriad of small objects. He placed them in the trough in front of Mark. To Mark, these objects were just chunks of metal, but he knew really that they were a lot more than that. He then gently picked up the first object, and for a moment, just hold it in his hands and stare at it left him in awe. He then slowly immersed it in the water and began to scrub with one of the soft brushes. The dirt came off quickly to reveal what he could only class as a part of the engine. Suddenly, Mark heard a shout, and he peered outside of the tent to see what was going on. Over on the far side of the crater, 2 of the team members were waving their arms erratically. "What's happening?" Mark cried. Dr. Perlman called back. "We have found proof. This is what we're looking for." Mark's heart then leapt into its mouth. Mark went back into the tent and continued to watch the objects. Some bore the scars of bullet and anti-aircraft gun rounds. Suddenly, Dr. Perlman came running in with another tray of objects and placed them on the table behind Mark. "This is it," he said exactly. Mark turned to face the table, and there in the tray, 7 objects of different sizes. One in particular stood out from the rest, a smallest square with a long line of mud trailing out from it. The doctor looked at Mark, his eyes wide open with glee. "Please clean this one now. This should be the answer to everything." Mark took hold of the object and turned to the trough and immersed it in the water. Slowly he stroked the object with his fingers, allowing the mud to slowly dissolve. He found the soft brush he could find and gently caressed it till all the mud had gone. He lifted it out of the murky water. To Mark's amazement, it was a dog tag. It was spotless and in immaculate condition. The gentle voice of Dr. Perlman came from behind him. "There he is," he said. Mark turned. "Who?" he replied. The doctor gently took hold of the tag and moved it into the light. "This is the proof we needed. This tag belonged to Captain Peter Elgar, the pilot." Mark could hear a quivering tone in his voice. He knew the doctor was emotional about his work, but he didn't realise that he would see him in tears. In the faded light, Mark could see actual tears trickling down the doctor's cheeks. "We have been at this all day. Maybe we should retire for the night," Mark calmly said. "We still have plenty of time to find the rest of the aircraft." And with that, Dr. Perlman agreed. They turned off the tent light and went outside to tell the rest of the team the news. The team breathed a sigh of relief. Although their search had ended here at the farm, there was still plenty to do. Finding the rest of the plane and its crew and documenting everything they find. So there was still plenty of work ahead of them. With the news being told, they all quietly placed their tools to the side of the fence. They stood in a line and bowed in the direction of the aircraft. With that done, they all slowly and without saying a word went back to the wash tent and got cleaned up ready for their evening meal. For the next week, the team, Mark and Renee, would work tirelessly on the site. Boxes and crates of remnants were marked and placed in lorries, ready to be shipped back to England. The important finds were labelled differently to the rest. Mark and Renee talked about it regularly, and they decided that they must be the boxes for the crew, or what was left of them. Every night after they finished working and downed their tools, they would all hear the engines. Night after night, the Phantom would fly over, and not once did it crash like before. They would all sit around and discuss what it could possibly be, and again, as before, no one had the answers. The last day arrived. The team had respectfully returned the ground to as true as it was before the work had started. All the team, except for Dr. Perlman, had given their thanks and their regards to Mark and his family, and left with the remaining equipment. The doctor walked over to Mark and firmly grasped his hand. "I don't know how to thank you enough." He put his arms around Mark. He then drew away. "I will call you with any information we get," and the doctor got into his car and drove off down the farm's drive and off into the distance. 2 weeks had passed, and life on the farm had returned to as normal as it could be. Mark and Maria would talk about the experiences from time to time, but in general, the conversation about that time was kept short and sweet. But that afternoon, Mark walked over to the site, placed his arms on the fence, and began to reminisce over the whole experience. From the tales his father used to tell, through to the excavation of the site and the finding of the remains. One thing still confused Mark. The engines were still being heard at night time. The same droning, no other sounds. Just the passing of a DB7 and then fading off into the distance. And Mark all of a sudden heard this droning sound again, but this one was different. Mark turned to the direction of the noise to see Dr. Perlman's car pulling up the drive. He pulled up to next to the side and got out of his car with speed and raced over to Mark. I have good news, Mark, the doctor screeched with excitement. It was then the last of the squadron. I was too excited to call you, so I came here in person. Mark smiled. That's wonderful news, Mark replied. The doctor ushered Mark to the farmhouse. I have some more news for you. Let's talk about it over some coffee. And they entered the house. After a few minutes, the doctor, Mark, Maria and Rene were sitting at the table drinking coffee and chatting about the excavation. I have a question to ask you all, the doctor finally said calmly, placing his coffee mug down on the table. The people I work for have asked if we can place a memorial here at the site. Mark looked at Maria, then turned back to the doctor. You don't have to ask, Doctor. The answer will always be yes. Those lads need to be remembered. A smile arose from all at the table. The doctor clasped his hands together. Thank you, he replied. The conversation then turned to the sounds of the DB7 flying over. Mark explained to the doctor that the sounds had been heard every night since they discovered the dog tags and hasn't stopped. The doctor listened carefully and a moment's silence ensued. I have no explanation for it, he finally replied. A few more weeks had gone by, and apart from a few phone calls from the doctor, not much had happened, apart from the nightly phantom DB7 returning for a fly past. Today was the day of the memorial to be unveiled. No one had seen it, and Mark and his family had all honoured this by not looking themselves. By noon, a small herd of media had arrived, along with the recovery team and Dr. Perlman. A short speech was heard, and the white dust cover was removed to reveal a memorial stone to be proud of. The Royal Air Force crest with a DB7 above it. Underneath were the names of the lost crew. Tears flowed down Mark and Maria's face as they all said a prayer. 2 days later, Mark called the doctor. This is hard to explain, Mark exclaimed. I still can't get my head around this. The engine noise has stopped. The first night after, we waited to hear it, but nothing. Last night, we waited, but still nothing. We can't explain it. The doctor remained silent throughout. Finally, with a faint voice, the doctor replied, They have been found. They are at peace, and they have completed their journey home, and promptly hung up the phone. Mark put down the phone and turned to Maria. They are at peace, but we won't forget them. Maria promptly got out of a chair, walked out into the garden. She picked the best rose she could find, walked over to the fence, placed the rose onto the foot of the memorial. Good night.